Well, things are heating up in the war in Ukraine. It seems the Ruskies aren't taking too kindly to the Uknats taking back those villages and towns that apparently the Ruskies had only lightly defended around Kharkov in, let's say, northeastern Ukraine. Ukraine's kind of oval shaped, so it's hard to pinpoint exactly what you call that, but I'd call that northeast. Anyway, I talked about that yesterday. It was the first territorial advancement that the Ukrainians have ever made in their history of their conflict with Russia, since the Euromaidan coup. So that was yesterday's news. Today's news is that the Ruskies are retaliating, not by trying to just take back these villages. They have apparently, according to the Ukrainians themselves, launched missile strikes on Ukrainian power plants and energy infrastructure across the entire country. And so they were having power outages in a lot of the major cities, Zaporozhye, Dnipropetrovsk, or Dnipro, I forget which is which. I think I'll call it Dnipro since that's the shorter one. I think that's the Ukrainian name. Anyway, Kharkov, I think, was having problems. Kiev seemed to have, I think, in Odessa. Anyway, there was a bunch of major cities that they said were having power issues at any given time. They're also reporting, the Ukrainian media, now this could just be propaganda, but they're saying, oh, well, power's been restored. I'm sure not everywhere, but in some places probably they've been able to get the power back online. And sure, in time, they probably will be able to, get a lot of the power back on. The lights won't stay off forever, but this is something that we have, and this is interesting. The Russians with Attitude podcast, I occasionally will check their Twitter feed. They pointed this out as well, but this is something sort of at the beginning of the war that I remember talking about, that not a lot of people, I think, remember at this point, and certainly people in the West. They have their brains are so melted by all this that they have no way of comparing, what's going on in Ukraine now to any sort of, historical event other than maybe, I don't know, Hitler, because they think Putin is Hitler. But back at the beginning of the Ukraine war, I remember, me and other people comparing the way that the Ruskies are going into Ukraine to how America went into Iraq, and how the Ruskies seem to be going into Ukraine wanting to grab territory and not, level the place. They did not want to flatten Ukraine. They did not want to destroy Ukraine. They wanted to capture it. Whereas, the United States, when the U.S. military went into Iraq, they flattened Iraq with a, bombing campaign that lasted like months before the first American soldiers set foot in Iraq. So they made sure that the country was destroyed and that there would be no resistance, at least no real organized resistance, and that the country, was non-functioning by the time that the Americans arrived. They essentially softened it up by just blowing things to smithereens. And the Ruskies, when they did this, they only seemed to really go after, like, military targets. They were not targeting civilian infrastructure. Notably, cell phones were still working throughout Ukraine. The trains were still operating. People were able, who were worried, oh my gosh, the Russians are coming. If they wanted to flee their town, they could just get on the train and leave. The tracks had not been blown up. The power was not out. Their cell phones were still working. But now, for the first time, we're seeing the Ruskies really directly and intentionally target civilian infrastructure, ostensibly with the intention of causing harm to the civilian population and trying to destabilize Ukrainian society. Now, this is sort of normal behavior in a war, but the Ruskies had refrained from this so far. So, with that said, sure, this initial attack, might not cripple all of Ukraine and shut down their power everywhere. But who's to say the Ruskies won't launch a second wave of missile strikes on these power plants around the country in major cities? I think we are in a new chapter of the war now. The Ruskies interpret what happened the other day, I think, as an escalation. They probably are quite embarrassed about what happened. And so now, they're taking the gloves off. to a certain extent. And they're going to start destroying civilian infrastructure. That seems to me to be the obvious conclusion that you would draw here. They are going to make it so that Ukrainian society ceases to function. And that obviously would make their jobs, a lot easier. Those railroads, for example, that are being used to transport all of this military aid, from Poland, where it sort of is built up, and there's this big U.S.-run camp there where they, it's like a rail yard where they're loading all the aid from around the world, around Europe and the U.S. and Canada, onto these trains, sending them into Ukraine to where they're distributed throughout the country. The Ruskies might just decide, you know what, we're going to blow up those railroad tracks so you can't do that anymore. We're going to shut the power off in Kiev so you can't keep entertaining people like Annalena Baerbock, or I'm sure Liz Truss in due time would show up in Kiev, and Antony Blinken. So for the folks who live in the part of Ukraine where the fighting is not going on, they are probably going to see their lives impacted even more than it already has been. Because certainly they've been impacted, I'm sure, economically. But in terms of, they take a step outside and they look around their house, a lot of these people who live in these cities that are not, directly at odds with the Ruskies, their lives can be somewhat normal. At least it looks normal. They turn on the light switch, the light comes on. They open the fridge, it's cold. But old Putin might just decide, you know what, enough of that. You folks are going to have to be made to suffer a little more so that you stop resisting. That, to me, seems to be what's going on here. It's exactly the same sort of thing that you would see in the war in Iraq. Of course, not that intense yet. I don't think the Russians have started bombing the water treatment plants like the Saudis do in Yemen. And I think I remember some story about that with Baghdad. I mean, I'm sure it happened, but I mean intentionally. Because here's the thing: Putin doesn't want all of Ukraine. At least I still don't think that he does. And by he, I mean his administration. Same thing when I talk about Joe Biden, I mean the Biden administration. I don't think that the Ruskies plan on taking the whole country still. Now, could they? Under certain circumstances, I don't think they'd turn it down. But at this stage, I still think, no, they're going to take, certain chunks of Ukraine, which I've discussed in the past. And so he might not care about burning his bridges in that part of Ukraine that they have no interest in holding or occupying. The Ruskies, they probably want to preserve places like Odessa, but other parts of Ukraine, like Lviv, the Ruskies don't give a damn about that city. They don't give a damn about the people there. They don't care if the people there hate them, because they already do hate them. And so I think the logic might be, if you make them suffer enough, make their lives a little more difficult, start turning the screws, well, then they can be persuaded to end this fruitless resistance. Now, this won't happen overnight, and obviously there's still a lot left that the Ruskies can do. Maybe they're just doing this to give them a taste. Maybe they're just sort of trying to send a message with this first wave and say, you know what, your modern lifestyle is quite fragile, and you can't protect it. Because that is the truth. The Ukrainians ultimately can't stop the Ruskies from doing to them what George Bush did to Iraq in the lead up to the Iraq War. Putin can bomb Ukraine's infrastructure back to the Stone Age, and you know what? He can avoid those cities. He could go harder against the cities that he doesn't care about, that he is not contesting, just to send a message, just to cause pain, and be softer on the cities that he is contesting. We could, by the end of this war, even though Odessa is a contested city and Lviv is not, we could see Lviv completely decimated and leveled to the ground, salt the earth, and Odessa, relatively unscathed. That is a possibility. So with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.